Hillchos of Adam, Chapter 7:1. The wording of a bill of release must connote that it is severing the connection between the slave and his master, so that his master no longer has any rights with regard to him. Therefore, if a master writes to a slave, "You and everything I own except for such and such a property or such and such a garment are now your property," the connection between them is not severed. The bill of release is nullified, and since the bill of release is not effective, the slave is not freed and he does not acquire any of the property. The same principles apply in all analogous situations too. When a slave brings a bill of release that states, "Your person and my property are acquired by you," he acquires his own person and becomes a free man immediately. He does not, however, acquire the property until the authenticity of the signatures to the document are verified, as is the law with regard to other legal documents. Similarly, if the document states, "All my property is acquired by you," he acquires his own person, but does not, however, acquire the property until the authenticity of the signatures to the document is verified. We divide the content of the document and say he acquires his own freedom, for we trust him when he brings his own bill of release, and he does not have to verify the authenticity of the document. With regard to the property, a person does not acquire it unless he has clear proof of ownership. Therefore, he does not acquire it until the authenticity of the document is verified. 3. When the master frees two slaves with one bill of release, they do not acquire their freedom. Instead, one must write a bill of release for each slave individually. Therefore, if a person writes a single legal document transferring all of his property to two slaves, they do not acquire even their own persons. If the master wrote two documents, one for each slave, they acquire the property and free each other. When does the above apply? When the master wrote in each legal document, "All my property is given to so-and-so and to so-and-so, my slaves." If whoever he writes, "Half of my property is given to so-and-so, my slave, and the other half is given to so-and-so, my slave," even if the owner wrote two documents, the slaves did not acquire anything, for the slaves are included in the master's property, and possession of half of each one is retained. Thus, it is not a valid release, since the slave was not freed. He does not acquire any of the property. 4. When a person seeks to release half of his slave with a bill of release, the slave does not acquire half of his person. He is a slave just as he was before. If, by contrast, he releases half of a slave because of monetary payment, for instance, he took money for half his worth with the intent of freeing that half, the transaction is binding. Thus, he is a half slave and half free man. When does the above apply? When the master released half of the slave and retained half. If, however, he freed half of the slave with a legal document and sold the other half, or he freed half with a legal document and gave the other half as a present, since the slave leaves his domain entirely, the slave acquires half of his person, and he is half a slave and half a free man. Similarly, when a slave is owned by two partners and one frees his half, whether through money or through a legal document, the slave acquires his half, and he is half slave and half free man. 5. When a master composes a bill of release for his maidservant who is pregnant, saying, "You are free, but your child remains a slave," his words are binding. If whoever states, "You remain a maidservant, but your child is to be free," it is of no consequence, for this is as if he freed half of the maidservant using a legal document. 6. With regard to a shubcharufa, if the master desires to free her other half, making her a woman who is consecrated entirely, he may free her, whether with money or with a legal document, for even money completes her release. 7. A person who is half slave and half free is not permitted to marry a Canaanite maidservant nor a free woman. Therefore, we compel his master to make him a free man, and we have a promissory note composed stating that the slave owes the master half his due, half his value. When does the above apply? For a male slave, for a male is commanded to be fruitful and multiply. A maidservant, however, should remain in her immediate state and serve her master one day and herself the next. If sinners treat her loosely, we compel her master to free her, and we have a promissory note composed stating that she owes the master half her value. 8. When a person is half slave and half free, and his master transferred the half he owns to his son, who is below majority, so that the court would not be able to compel him to release him, the court appoints a guardian for the minor. The guardian writes a bill of release, and we have a promissory note composed stating that the slave owes the master half his value. If the minor needs the slave and has pangs of yearning for the slave, we separate him from him with money, for a minor has a great attraction for money. 9. When a dying man was a legal document composed transferring all of his property to his servant recovers, he regains possession of his property. He does not, however, regain possession of the servant, for he has already acquired the reputation of being a free man. Chapter 8:1. When a person sells a slave to a Gentile, the slave is released as a free man. We compel the previous owner to buy him back from the Gentiles, even at 10 times his value. He then composes a bill of release for him, and the slave is released. The Gentile purchaser does not desire to sell the slave back even at 10 times his value. We do not require the owner to make another offer. This fine is only collected and brought to judgment in a court of expert judges. If the seller dies, we do not require his heir to return the slave so that he can free him. 2. The following rules apply when a person borrows money from a Gentile and offers a slave as a collateral. If the borrower fixed the time and told the Gentile, "If this and this date arrives and I have not paid you, you acquire the body of the slave must be released immediately. If he told him, "Acquire the proceeds of his work," the slave is not released. If the Gentile expropriated the slave as payment for his debt, or attackers came upon the master and sought to kill him, and he redeemed himself by giving them his slave, the slave is not freed, for he was taken from the master against his will. 3. If a person sells a slave to one of the servants of a king or his opposites, despite the fact that the seller fears them, the slave receives his freedom. for he could have appeased them with money. 4. In the following instance, a person sold his slave to a Gentile for 30 days, sold him except for his work, sold him except for the mitzvahs, or sold him except for the Shabbos and festivals. There is an unresolved question whether the slave is free or not. Therefore, if the slave seizes property belonging to the former master that equals his worth, that he can purchase his freedom from the Gentile, it is not expropriated from him. 5. Whether a Jew sells a slave to a Gentile who serves idols, a Gerteshev, or even a Kuti, the slave is granted his freedom. If he sells his slave to an apostate Jew, there is an unresolved question regarding the matter. Therefore, if the slave seizes property belonging to his former master that equals his worth, that he can purchase his freedom from the apostate, it is not expropriated from him. 6. When a person living in Eretz Yisrael sells a slave to a master from the diaspora, the slave is granted his freedom and compels his new master to compose a bill of release from him, and his money is forfeited. Why did I say just penalize the purchaser alone in this instance? Because if he had not purchased the slave would not have left Eretz Yisrael for the diaspora. Selling a slave to Syria or Acre is considered as selling him to the diaspora. There is an unresolved question whether an inhabitant of Babylonia marries a woman in Eretz Yisrael with the intent of returning to Babylonia, the woman being slaves and maidservants to his household. There is doubt whether they are considered as having been sold to the diaspora, for the husband has the right to fruits of his labor, and they are of their labor, and they are not considered as having been sold to him, since their physical person belongs to the woman. 8. When a slave follows his master to Syria and his master sells him there, the slave is considered to have forfeited his privilege. When does the above apply? When his master took him to the diaspora with the intent not to return to Eretz Yisrael. If, however, his master's intent was to return and the slave followed him with that intent, should the master sell him there, he is granted his freedom. He compel the purchaser to release him. 9. When a slave asks his master to move to Eretz Yisrael, he compels his master to move there with him or sell him to someone who is moving there. When the master living in Eretz Yisrael desires to move to the diaspora, he cannot compel the slave to move with him against his will. This law applies in all times, even in the present era when the land is ruled by Gentiles. 10. When a slave flees from the diaspora to Eretz Yisrael, he should not be returned to slavery. Considering such a person, the Torah Deuteronomy 23:16 states, do not return a slave to his master. His master is told to compose a bill of release for him, and he writes a permissive note for his master or for his worth, which the master holds until the freed slave earns that money and gives it to him. If the master does not decide to free him, the court invalidates his ownership of him. The slave is free to go on his way. 11. This slave who fled toward Israel is a righteous convert. Scripture adds a specific warning for anyone who desired to divide him, for he is even more humble-spirited than a convert. Therefore, Scripture, Deuteronomy 23:17, issues a command with regard to him. He shall dwell with you in your midst in one of your cities that he desires. You shall not abuse him. Abusing him refers even to verbal derision. Thus, a person who derides this convert transgresses 3 negative commandments. A person should not abuse his colleague, Leviticus 25:14. Do not abuse a convert, Exodus 22:20, and you shall not abuse him. He also transgresses the commandment, do not oppress him, Exodus, but he, as explained with regard to the laws of Ainah 12. When a person purchases a slave from a Gentile without making a stipulation beforehand, the slave does not desire to be circumcised or to accept the mitzvahs incumbent upon slaves. He is given leeway for 12 months. If at the end of this period he still does not desire, the master must sell him to a Gentile or to the diaspora. If the slave made a stipulation with the master at the outset, they did not have to circumcise. They did not have to circumcise himself. The owner may retain him as a Gentile as long as he desires, and may sell him to a Gentile or the diaspora. Similarly, even when a slave who has been circumcised and immersed himself to become a slave, but afterwards caused himself to be captured by a group of brigands, and if his master cannot expropriate him neither through the laws of the Jews nor through the laws of the Gentiles, he may accept payment for it from a Gentile and formalize the sale to the Gentile authorities, for he is preserving his money from the Gentiles. 13. When a person declares a slave ownerless, the slave is granted his freedom. A bill of release must be composed for him. If the master who declared him ownerless dies, his heir should compose the bill of release. 14. The following will apply when a slave was imprisoned, flees from jail. If the master despaired of regaining ownership of him, he is granted his freedom. His master is compelled to compose a bill of release for him. 15. The following will apply when a slave is taken captive by Gentiles. If his first master despaired of regaining ownership of him, anyone who redeems him with the intent that he remain a slave may subjugate him and he becomes his property. If he redeemed him with the intent that he becomes free, he is granted his freedom. If the slave's first owner did not despair of regaining ownership, the person who redeems the slave with the intent that he remain a slave should take back the money he spent to redeem him from the owner. The slave is returned to his original owner. If he redeemed him with the intent of freeing him, he is returned to the original owner without any payment. 16. If the master makes a slave an apothecary for his creditor and then frees the slave is freed. We also compel the creditor to free him as well. This is a measure enacted for the correction of the society, lest the creditor encounter the slave at a later time and say, "You are my slave." 17. When a master marries his slave to a free woman, places a stone on his head, or tells him to read 3 verses from a Torah scroll in public, or the like, i.e. matters in which only a freed person is obligated, he is considered to be free. We compel his master to compose a bill of release for him. Similar rules apply when the slave took a vow that we compel slaves to fulfill, as we have stated with regard to vows, and instead of compelling his master, the vow is annulled. Since he did not compel him in a situation in which he should have compelled him, he indicated that he was concluding his subjugation of him. From this, I conclude that if a person frees his slave while speaking any language and other statements that indicate that his intent is that he does not retain any authority over him at all and is resolved to accept the step, he cannot retract. We compel him to write a bill of release, even though he has not written one already. If, however, a person borrows money from his slave, makes him a guardian, the slave puts on full in his master's presence, or reads 3 verses in the synagogue, and his master's presence, his master does not rebuke him, he does not obtain his freedom. 18. It is forbidden for a person to teach his slave Torah. If he teaches him, he is not granted his freedom. 19. If a person purchases a slave from the Gentile and the slave takes the initiative and immerses himself in the intent of becoming free in the presence of his master, he attains his freedom. If he does this outside his master's presence, he must explicitly state his intent. Accordingly, the slave's master must push him into the water. 20. If a Jew sees his possession of a Gentile who is a minor or finds a Gentile child and has him immersed with the intent that he become a convert, he becomes a convert. If his intent was the Gentile become a slave, he becomes a slave. If his intent was to become a free man, he becomes a free man. 21. The slaves and maidservants of the convert take the initiative and immerse themselves in his presence, they attain their freedom. Chapter 9. 1. When a Jew has relations with a Canaanite maidservant, even if she is his own maidservant, offspring is considered a Canaanite slave with regard to all matters, and one may use him for service forever as any other slave. 2. The laws applying to a Canaanite slave apply whether the master purchases the Canaanite slave from a fellow Jew, a resident alien, a Gentile living under our jurisdiction, or a person from another nation. Similarly, a resident alien, a Gentile living under our jurisdiction, or a person from another nation has the prerogative of selling himself to a Jew as a slave, and then he is a slave with regard to all matters. Similarly, when a Gentile sells his sons and his daughters, they become Canaanite slaves. This is reflected by Leviticus 25:45. From the children of the residents, from them and from their families who are with you, who give birth in your land, may you purchase. All these are the Canaanite slaves with regard to all matters. 3. If a person from another nationality engages in relations with one of our Canaanite maidservants, his son, who is conceived, is a Canaanite slave, is implied by the phrase Ibid, who gives birth in your land. If, however, one of our slaves has relations with a Gentile woman, the offspring is not a slave, is implied by the verse, who give birth in your land, for a slave is not considered to have any genealogical connection to his offspring. 4. When a Gentile king wages war, brings captives, sells them, a slave who is purchased in this manner is considered a Canaanite slave with regard to all matters. Same law applies if such a king grants permission for anyone who desires to go and kidnap people from the nation with whom he is waging war and then sell them as slaves, or if his laws state that whoever does not pay his taxes or does such and such fails to do so, such and such may be sold as a slave. The laws he ordains are binding, and these individuals are considered Canaanite slaves. 5. When a Gentile purchases another Gentile as a slave, he does not purchase a physical person, but only the fruits of his labor. Nevertheless, if the Gentile sells the slave to a Jew, his physical person is acquired by the Jew. 6. A woman may purchase maidservants, but she should not purchase slaves. Even those below the age of majority, lest suspicions of her modesty arise. If she does purchase them, she acquires their physical person as a man, but it appears to me that she is forbidden only to purchase slaves that are 9 years old or older. Similarly, it's forbidden for a person to free a Canaanite slave. Anyone who frees such a slave violates a positive commandment, for Leviticus 25:46 states, and you shall have them work for you forever. Nevertheless, if the master frees him, he attains his freedom, as we have explained. And once he frees him, he compels the master to compose a bill of release, conforming to all the laws we have described. If it is permitted to free a slave for the sake of a mitzvah, even a mitzvah of rabbinic origin. For instance, if 10 free men were not present in the synagogue, a person may free a slave to complete the quorum. Similar laws apply in all analogous situations. Similarly, if people are treating a person as a maidservant in a licentious manner, and she presents a stumbling block to sinful people, we compel her master to free her so that she will marry and thus remove the stumbling block. The same principles apply in all analogous situations. 7. A master may tell his Canaanite slave, work for me, but I will not provide you with sustenance, and the slave must instead go and beg from door to door and derive his sustenance from charity. For the Jews were obligated to support the slaves that live among them. When does the above apply? To a man's own slave, the court does not take any steps to protect the property of adults. If a person does not provide food and drink for his slaves in a fitting manner, they will flee or die. And a person who has great concern for his own money than anyone else. Different laws apply to everyone. To slaves that his wife brought into the household as nichsei miluk, he is obligated to provide for their sustenance, for this is one of the conditions for bringing them into his household. For if the husband does not provide them with sustenance, they will die or flee, and he is not responsible for them. 8. It is permissible to have a Canaanite slave perform excruciating labor. Although this is the law, the attribute of piety and the way of wisdom is for a person to be merciful and pursue justice, not to make a slave carry a heavy yoke, nor cause them distress. He should allow them to partake in all the food and drink he serves. This was the practice of the sages of the first generation, who would give their slaves from every dish in which they themselves would partake, and they would provide food for their animals and slaves before partaking of their own meals. And so it is written in Psalms 123:2, as the eyes of the slave to their master's hand, and like the eyes of a maidservant to her mistress' hand, so to our eyes to God. Similarly, we should not embarrass a slave by our deeds or with words, for the Torah prescribed that they perform service, not that they be humiliated, nor should one shout or vent anger upon them extensively. Instead, one should speak to them gently and listen to their claims. This is explicitly stated with regard to the positive paths of Job, for which he was praised. Job 31:13, 15. Have I ever shunned justice for my slave and maidservant when they quarreled with me? Did not he who made me in my belly make him? Was it not the one who prepared us in the womb? Cruelty and arrogance are found only among idol-worshipping Gentiles. By contrast, the descendants of Abraham, our patriarch, i.e. the Jews, whom The Holy One, blessed be He, granted the goodness of the Torah and commanded to observe righteous statutes and judgments, are merciful to all. And similarly, with regard to the attributes of the Holy One, blessed be He, which He commanded us to emulate, as is written in Psalm 145:9, His mercies are upon all His works, and whoever shows mercy to others will have mercy shown to him, as in Deuteronomy 13:18, it will show you mercy and be merciful upon you and multiply you. Blessed be God who grants assistance. This concludes the 12th book. With the help of the Almighty, the amount of chapters in this book are 75. Hilchos Mechira 30 chapters. Hilchos Chiyam 12 chapters. Hilchos Shchenim 14 chapters. Hilchos Shluchim V'Shutfin 10 chapters. Hilchos Avadim 9 chapters.